Okay, thank you so much for the introduction and everyone for joining in to listen in on this really fascinating collection of mannequin research. So, as I'm sure you've all realized listening in on these talks, sexual selection is a pretty incredible evolutionary force, and it's played a role in shaping some of the most memorable traits and behaviors that we see throughout many different animal taxa. And so, given its potential to shape organisms, often the next question that we have is what actually limits it? An environment and natural selection directly limiting sexually selected traits, whether it's size or color, um, is fairly straightforward, but we're also interested in how environment and abiotic conditions might influence expression of sexually selected behaviors. For example, this spring, in response to the dramatic reduction in traffic noise, sparrows in San Francisco altered the ways in which they were singing their songs. And so when we think about how the abiotic environment might influence organisms, oftentimes we revert to temperature because it's really well studied. There's really clear physiological mechanisms for how extreme hot or cold conditions influence organisms. But another abiotic axis of variation that can be important for organisms is precipitation. And we think a lot about how a lack of precipitation can shape organisms. Drought is a really well known driver of evolution, but too much rain can also influence fitness. And this might be particularly relevant in the tropics, where in a typical tropical rainforest, temperature is going to be really constant, and instead it's rainfall that varies dramatically with the seasons. And of course, this is important for the plant communities in these places, but increasingly we're realizing that it also has ramifications for the endotherms in these habitats, whether it's through direct or indirect effects on survival, thermoregulation, food, or fecundity. And so I'm really interested in how rainfall regime um, and this abiotic environment could influence or constrain sexually selected behaviors. So what better group to ask this kind of question than the mannequins, where we can look at how sexually selected behaviors might be influenced by variation in rainfall. The species that I'm going to be talking about today are white-ruffed manakins. They're pretty small, on in considering, but they have pretty lengthy lifespans, as with many other manakin species. They like to hang out in Central America and northern South America, and they are found in mid-elevation, montane, quite rainy primary tropical forests. So in this species, males center their display sites around fallen mossy logs. Each log has its own dominant or alpha male. Some logs will also have subordinate males. Um, and females, of course, are assessing all of these males. Frequently, there's quite high reproductive skew. Most males have little to no reproductive success. Females are uniformly green. Males actually have a delayed plumage maturation process. So in their second year, they're green with just a little bit of a gray beard and mustache. In their third year, they start to get their Zorro mask and more of a ruff, and then after their third year, they become their definitive blue-black plumage with the full white ruff. And then at that point, they may become alpha at a display log, but not necessarily. Sometimes they're subordinate, sometimes they just float around. And even once they do become alpha at a log, that still doesn't mean that they actually have any reproductive success necessarily. So this species was initially started to be intensively studied at a site called Rara Avis, which is on the Caribbean slope of Costa Rica, and I'll show its values associated with this site in sort of a turquoise. So this is a really very rainy place, gets over 8 meters of rain every year. And between 2008 and 2013, Alice Boyle and another colleague, Megan Jones, really started intensively studying behavior in this population and physiology relating to altitudinal migration and cooperation amongst males. So throughout the course of those projects, they discovered that rain is really an important driver of physiology, behavior, and life history trade-offs in this species. So birds experience storms as physiological stressors. We see mortality after big storm events. Um, some individuals, and especially males, will migrate to lower elevations to escape the heavy rainfall of the non-breeding season. But when these males come back to breeding elevation in the subsequent breeding season, they lose status, and females actually prefer males that didn't migrate. The estimates of apparent survival in this population are really surprisingly low, given the lifespan of this species, um, and as compared to other manakin species, and even compared to a different population. This is a subspecies on the Pacific slope where of this where they've calculated estimates of apparent survival of 0.9. They get about half as much rain there, but really at a place that's getting over 8 meters of rain and 38% of the population isn't surviving to the next year, it's a pretty remarkably low estimate of apparent survival. In addition, behavior at this site is really dynamic. Social hierarchies are constantly fluctuating. There's a lot of turnover in which display sites males are using and how long they use them for. So this really, when I started my PhD, I was very excited about asking this question of whether rain is constraining display behavior and contributing to variability in this species. So I hypothesized that this might happen through indirect effects of rain. So in a place that's getting a ton of rain, we expect increased overgrowth, faster decomposition. Maybe that's influencing the lifespan, basically, of the sites that these males are using for their displays. Of course, the rain could also have a direct effect on mortality, especially given those estimates of apparent survival. So I've hypothesized there could be direct rain effects, which would influence basically the turnover in the population of individuals due to increased mortality. Rain could also have non-lethal effects. So I hypothesized that the effect of rain could result in energetic costs and behavioral changes, which could alter the intensity of male-male competition, how much males invest in display. And for females, that might alter how much investment they put into choosing potential mates. So to test these hypotheses, I set up a field site at a place that gets about half as much rain every year. This is Volcan Tenorio. I'll show data relating to it in yellow. So this is also on the Caribbean slope, only a little over 100 kilometers northwest. I wanted to stay on that Caribbean slope to avoid any confounding subspecies issues by going down to the Pacific slope. And so I was there between 2016 and 2019, mainly did behavioral observations between 17 and 19. And so at these sites, we do see differences in how much rain falls. So this is the amount of rain at these sites in the 9 months leading up to a breeding season. So this is how much rain fell at Rar Avis in the turquoise in the 9 months before the 2009 breeding season. This is how much rain fell in the 9 months leading up to the 2018 field season at Tenorio. At both of these sites, we located display logs by sound or observation. We set up blinds and observed those display sites over the course of the breeding season, and in the course of those observations, recorded who we saw, what they did, how long they did it for. The number of display sites that we watched, of course, varied year to year. I present all of these comparisons as proportion of logs in a given year so that we deal with that variability. And we put in a fair amount of hours doing these observations across all of these years. All of the behavioral metrics that I'll present are either a proportion of time for a given year or a rate per 100 hours. So over the course of all of these observations at Tenorio in the last 4 years, we realized that it is less rainy, but it is shockingly windy. There's a really strong influence of trade winds coming in off of the Caribbean. And we also had an unexpected extreme weather event in that this area was pretty strongly affected by Hurricanes Nate and Otto between my 2017 field season and 2018 breeding season. So I will be pointing out some things that may be relevant to that. But forging ahead with our predictions about how rain might indirectly influence behavior through the turnover of the usable display logs in the population. we would predict that if a tree falls on a log or it grows over with vegetation, then of course that alpha male is going to have to move to a new display log. And so we predict that in a site that has less rain, this may happen less frequently, and in that case, we would see a lower proportion of logs becoming inactive in a given year. In fact, what we see is a lot of variability at the rainier site. Here, this is RA in the turquoise. But at the dry site, VT with the yellow, in one year, we have a value that's lower than what we see in any of the years at the rainy site. But then we have one year that's much higher. And so this year is shown in a triangle because that is the year immediately following the hurricane. And so I'll either have this hurricane symbol or it'll be a triangle throughout the talk. So a lot of logs became inactive following the hurricane. If we look at that relationship between rainfall in the months leading up to the breeding season, it does seem like there's a higher proportion of sites becoming inactive after years after rainier non-breeding seasons, with of course the exception of again this hurricane year where a lot of trees fell over. So in the absence of extreme weather events like hurricanes, there does seem to be some support for a lower turnover in display log use at the less rainy location. So we started thinking about what exactly results in logs becoming inactive. So at the drier site, we saw trees or branches falling on them. Of course, we saw decomposition or overgrowth of vegetation. And then there were some logs where they just went inactive. We couldn't see any difference in the log itself, but males were not using it and could have been something more related to the males themselves. We also saw logs become inactive due to changes in the forest structure around them. So this is a log that was active in 2017. It wasn't particularly pretty, but it was active and had females visiting. But in 2018, although nothing fell on it from the hurricane, a very large tree nearby, which you can kind of see, these are the roots of the base of that tree, toppled over, and it completely changed the canopy structure around it. And so that could be important for the species for a couple of reasons. One is that they do part of their display above the canopy and then dive down to their log. So that could have been messed up by this change in the canopy structure. And then of course, we've seen in the same genus evidence that the lighting conditions are very important for the displays on the log. So that of course is different now. And then with this increased light condition, there may be increased overgrowth of the vegetation as well. So if we look at the proportion of log fates basically at this dry site, even though there's less rain, in this really extreme year, over a quarter of our logs were either flattened or had some really remarkable change to the forest structure around them, which contributed potentially to them becoming inactive. And in a normal year, not after a hurricane, that's less than 10% of logs that are influenced by tree or branch fall. So I think keeping that in mind is definitely critical moving forward. As far as who's displaying at those logs, we predict that if direct rain effects are increasing mortality, then that, of course, is going to have some ramifications for the identity of males using a given display site. If one male dies or migrates, then another male might be able to take his place. And so at a site that has potentially reduced direct lethal effects of rain, we might expect those transitions between alphas to be less common. And in fact, we see that there's a ton of variability in the rainy site year to year. And at the dry site, it really falls well within the range of what's observed at the rainy site. And in relation to the rainfall from the previous non-breeding season, although there's a couple values of high transition in alpha identity in pretty rainy years, there's not really a clear pattern. So it doesn't seem like overall the rate of alpha male turnover is different between the sites. However, if we look at the combined proportion of logs that are either becoming inactive or have a change in the alpha, overall it's really quite high. The dry site is sort of years are similar to the years with highest turnover at the rainy site, and the absolute minimum proportion of logs that have some amount of change to them is like 60%, which is really striking when we think about other manakin species where that turnover has been calculated more as 32%. So I think overall that tells us that flexible use of display sites and dynamic social hierarchies are really a characteristic of this species. So then we wanted to know more about what the birds are actually doing. What are the behaviors that they're performing? How are they behaving at the display logs? So if rain is directly affecting birds, but not lethally, it might influence the strength of male-male competition and how much males are able to invest in display. And we might see that, we would predict that we would see that as manifested as the amount of time that the male spends near his display site, not necessarily always displaying, but in the vicinity available if a female were to show up. And so at a site with predicted reduced direct effects of rainfall energetic costs, we would predict that there would be males would be able to spend more time at their display sites. Again, the variability year to year at the rainy site is astonishing, from less than 20% of the time to 60%. At the drier site, it's towards the high end, similar to the years with the highest proportion of time spent, males spend at the logs at the rainy site. The hurricane year is a bit lower. And so one thing that we had noticed upon arriving after this hurricane was that there was a really striking shift in phenology of these fruiting plants, which the manakins depend on for food. And so many of these species that manakins depend on were growing new leaves and seem to have had their reproductive structures stripped off. And so this prompted us to try to quantify the amount of fruit that was available for these birds to consume. And what we saw was really much lower amounts of available ripe and unripe fruit in the breeding season immediately following the hurricane as compared to the subsequent breeding season. And so it seems like potentially, while we saw pretty similar attendance between sites, these sort of extreme weather events and changes in resource availability could influence how much time males were able to spend attending their logs. Differences in male-male competition could also influence who is displaying at the logs. So immature White-ruffed Manakin males, the second years and the third years, will frequently spend time practicing at active display logs. So alpha males will sort of allow them to practice when there's not a female around. And we predicted that if males are sort of having to grapple a bit more with this male-male competition and vying for position in social hierarchies, perhaps there would be less tolerance for young males to make use of active display sites that the adult males are trying to maintain ownership of. However, although we see some variation from year to year, overall the patterns, proportion of time that young males spend displaying are quite similar between the two sites. So that doesn't seem to be a difference in rainy and less rainy locations. However, the young males could also tell us something about the direct effects of rain and the turnover of individuals in the population as a consequence of mortality. So in a population that has higher survival, we would expect that the proportion of the population that's made up of young males would be lower because those adult males are surviving and continuing to be a part of the population. And actually, we do see that in the less rainy population, the young males make up a smaller proportion. There's proportionally more adult ATY males after third year males when compared to the rainy population. And in the lowest year at the dry population, where it's most similar to the rainy population, is actually the year immediately following the hurricane. So I think this is really suggestive of these direct effects of rain altering the makeup of the population and the distribution of age and the turnover of the males that are displaying at these field sites. And there does seem to be a difference between the two locations. So the million-dollar question, of course, is always what are the females doing? Female mannequins are notoriously difficult to keep track of. They're very cryptic, but we can look at what they're doing when they're actually visiting the display sites. And so if rain is influencing their energetic budgets, that may influence how much they invest in choosing potential mates. And so we can measure that by looking at how much time females spend assessing males, how much time males are spend displaying for females. And so we might predict that that would be higher in a less rainy place where females sort of have fewer constraints potentially. And actually what we see is really a striking similarity between the sites. At both sites, it varies from year to year as is the theme, but the range of variation is basically the same. And so this is really interesting, and it really seems to be that females are spending the same amount of time checking out males. But when we look at the rate of copulation, it's actually a fair bit lower at the dry site as compared to the rainy site. And the proportion of logs that females ultimately copulate on is also lower at the dry site than at the rainy site. So this is really interesting because even though they're spending the same amount of time assessing males, they seem to be a bit choosier potentially as to whom they ultimately mate with. And another possibility is that they may be mating with multiple males at the rainy site. We've seen in other species of manakin that females tend to mate with multiple males when they're mating with inexperienced males. And so this might get back to that difference in age distribution, and perhaps the population of males at the rainy site are more inexperienced because they are younger. And so we're seeing females sort of mating with multiple males more frequently at that site. So getting back to the big question of does rain contribute to this variability in display behavior, I think we do see fundamental differences in how females seem to be choosing mates based on those differences in rates of copulation and proportion of logs at which females copulate, although they are spending similar amounts of time assessing males. We don't really see much in the way of support for influencing the strength of male-male competition between the two sites. Those measures all came out pretty similarly. But I think the age distribution in captures that we see really support differences in survival between these two sites, and differences in sort of the turnover of individuals in the population. In terms of indirect rain effects, I think it's a little bit equivocal until we think about the fact that indirect climatic effects are not restricted to rainfall. So if we incorporate these extreme weather events, I think we really see support for tree fall, decomposition, these sorts of dynamic forest processes influencing how males use display sites. And so at our dry site, I think what we've seen is that extreme weather sort of replaces rain as a driver of dynamic forest structure. And where we do see differences between sites that aren't affected by that hurricane year, those really implicate rain as an important component. And so these extreme events may be helpful in interpreting some of the really incredible interannual variability that we see at both populations across years. So this sort of gets back to the idea that the distribution of rainfall, as well as the total amount, is important for determining organismal fitness. And as extreme weather events and intense storms and shifts in rainfall occur over the coming decades, it's going to be really important to consider how those influence resource availability and energy budgets, and keeping in mind that these abiotic selective forces are really critical to understanding more completely the evolutionary trajectories of these organisms as the interactions between environment and behavioral processes and other selective forces can influence the scope of sexual selection and life history. And so with that, if I have any time, I would be happy to take questions. I want to thank funding sources and all of these amazing folks who made data collection possible. Thank you very much.